This video was created to go over the process of analytical writing at the Stage 2 standard. The characteristics that we really want to see in Stage 2 are that students are writing in a more organic, flowing language that is both efficient and concise. So as we start to move into the higher levels of Stage 2, we see less allegiance to some of those traditional structures like teal, and we see more of a sense of where the writing needs to be and how closely and carefully constructed it is. We need to see a really strong connection and inclusion of the texts. Ultimately, analysis is all about drawing information from the text, so you need to make sure that you don't pull yourself away from that too much or focus more on ideas or abstract connections. Every element contributing needs to add value, complexity, and insight. So we see this done through the inclusion of three characteristics and a bit of flair. Blue represents a summary of the text. Your goal is not to summarize the story. Your goal is not to tell me what happened in the book. I've already read the book, so don't tell me anything I don't already know. That being said, you do need to create a connection with what you are trying to show and what happened in the book. So it's not about retelling the story, but it is about connecting what happened in the story with the point that you want to make. Quotes and evidence are really vital when it comes to the SACE. So including quotes within and integrating it into your writing is a really important step. The last point, which is purple, is about description of and connection of these elements to meaning. So it's really important that we don't just get into this habit of talking about what happened in the text. That's simply a summary. Even if we use quotes to back it up, we're still not telling anyone anything that they didn't already know from reading the book. But the description and elements in relationship to meaning is where our insight and ideas come from. The bit of flair that we also want to see is where you can, without overdoing it, you should be making reference to the author as the intentional creator of the text. We always frame things in the fact that the author deliberately did this, the author conveyed, the author represented, the author used, the author illustrated, and that really helps us create a sense of objectivity and control. I've taken an extract from a paragraph, and I'll make the point that this is not a paragraph. This is two sentences that were taken from a paragraph. But what I want you to see in this is how those elements that we illustrated before work together. So the first sentence reads, Steinbeck frames this contrast through the existence of the dream, which George and Lenny frequently use to separate themselves from most guys who work to get some coin and blow it on the cat house. So there's the first sentence. I used that bit of flair at the beginning. I could have just said in the book, but I say Steinbeck frames the contrast. Okay, now there's obviously a sentence beforehand and a sentence afterwards, but just in the terms of what I'm trying to say here, I want to talk about how we show clear points. I say through the existence of the dream. So in that case, I'm actually describing what the connection is. So when I say this contrast, we're assuming I've already said what the contrast is in the previous sentence, but my connection is through the purple when I say it's in this part of the story. And then I describe what happens in the story to reinforce the point that I made. So that reinforcement is really important in establishing that what you say is connected and relevant to the book. Next sentence. In comparison to the desperation illustrated for others, notice that's part of the sentence doesn't mention anything that happens in the story. It's a commentary beyond the story. The fact that I'm suggesting there's desperation in the story is my interpretation of it that I'm showing. Then I link it to the story. George and Lenny exclude themselves from the fate of those around them, but not us, suggesting that while others may suffer, they will prevail once they get the jack together and have a little house and a couple of acres. This represents their hope for a better existence. So notice how in this last part, I've used another piece of purple writing to reinforce that connection. This is what this represents. This is where I'm going with this. So the purple is really important in framing and constructing the meaning of the information that I'm sharing. A couple of other things that you'll notice in this case is that I'm integrating the quotes. Now what that means is rather than saying something and then including a quote straight afterwards, instead I take the words from the quote and I build those into the sentence that I'm saying. It's about not saying things twice. If you're looking to hit that higher level of evidence inclusion, the integration of quotes is really important. And that links to that quality I mentioned where we want to be concise and clear without repetition. So you can see I've done that in a number of cases, and these two sentences represent an inclusion of all three elements I talked about before in making a clear and well-evidenced point. Now I'm going to be showing you a couple of examples from student work, and let's have a bit of a look at some of the differences. So this was written based on a short story, The Lake. What you can see in this case is that it's largely summarising what happens in the story. Now what I'm going to suggest in this case is that when you're talking about bang for buck as a writer, you are wasting opportunities in this telling the reader things that they already know. If it's a 400-word paragraph, I've got 200 words or so in front of me that actually have no value to them. And that's what we really want to avoid. We want every sentence and every piece of information to count and add value to the skills we're trying to demonstrate. This is all purple. So in this case, the students' written memories show different circumstances that people have gone through. Now, this is actually connected to the story The Lake, because this idea of memory and grief is a big part of the story. But I bet you can guess what the key issue is here, and it's the fact that the student has focused all on the ideas and the meaning of the story, but they haven't reinforced anything that they've said by connecting it to what actually happened in the story. We don't want too much summary. You can't just tell me what I already know from reading, but that doesn't mean that you can tell me nothing. Because if you just commentate on the ideas or the meaning of the story, but you don't link it to any evidence, then there's no logic or connection to suggest you're actually analysing the book, and it reads more like just a rant that could have come from anywhere. Example 3 starts taking a step in the right direction. You notice while there would have been a sentence above and below this section, during this section, I don't really know what that idea is. And I think it's okay if you use one or two pronouns directly after the reference to an idea. But if you keep saying this through an entire paragraph and someone has missed that first sentence, again, you're not writing as clearly and effectively as you could. Now you'll notice the missing element in this case is that the student hasn't included any quotes. So that's a really important element which is part of the assessment criteria at the higher level English. So you need to make sure you're on top of that. Now example 4 is the best example that came through the class, and this you can see it's not perfect, but it certainly does combine together those colours with much greater consistency. You can see here the text initially uses Harold's tragic memories of her death in order to show how his grief does not dissolve through time. That's a commentary on the piece. This is further emphasised later in the text when he returns to the lake with his wife. Now that's the description of something he does in the story. I know that because I've read it, but telling me that is really important because it reinforces the point that you're trying to make beforehand. They've shown the quote in here in this case. Now it's not an uncommon thing that students kind of just tack on a quote at the end, and it's not a bad thing. There's a little bit of kind of different preference between different teachers. What we really want to do when we can is if we see opportunities to integrate quotes within our sentences, we should be using them. We don't want them always kind of just thrown on the end. Hopefully you can use this tool of assessing the quality of your writing to actually improve your work moving forward.